Welcome everyone, this is AndresRestart. This time we're going to be talking about how the world in Breath of the Wild 2 is going to be different from Breath of the Wild 1. Eiji Aonuma did confirm to us that we would be returning to Hyrule for this next Legend of Zelda game. But how exactly is it going to be changing? Some have speculated that it could basically be the same. I don't think that's going to be the case. I think there are going to be some massive, drastic changes, and in this video, that's exactly what we're going to be talking about. So before we jump into the topic for this video, I first want to talk about some recent news that came out about when Breath of the Wild 2 could be coming out. So apparently Sabby, a known credible leaker, is saying that the internal plan is for the game to come out in 2020. This lines up with what I've been saying. I feel like there's a lot of evidence to support Breath of the Wild 2 coming out 2020. I think holiday 2020 is the right time, but it should be noted that even if Nintendo is actually planning to come out with the game sometime in 2020, Zelda games could potentially be delayed, but I'm optimistic that this time around that will not happen. They've already mastered the physics engine with Breath of the Wild. I think this time around they know exactly what they're doing, and Nintendo will be able to get the game out on time, which apparently is going to be for next year. So by all means, let me know what you think of that in the comments below, but let's actually get on with the topic now. So how exactly is Hyrule going to be changing? We know that we are going to be returning to Hyrule. This has been confirmed by Eiji Aonuma. But if we're going to be returning to Hyrule, how is it going to be different? It has to be different because this is going to be a whole new game. We want it to feel fresh and new. Well, there's several ways it could be changing. If we take a look at the end of the Breath of the Wild 2 trailer, what we see is Hyrule Castle rising from the ground, and we see tremors, we see all of Hyrule trembling. What if these seismic shifts that are being caused by Ganondorf resurrecting and perhaps causing Hyrule Castle to rise in the air, maybe these tremors are going to cause changes to the actual landscape for Hyrule. These earthquakes could cause cracks in the ground, mountains to open up other new paths, valleys to break down. The entire landscape for Hyrule could change dramatically. Like I said, it could reveal new paths or perhaps dungeons that were unseen in Breath of the Wild, but something else this could impact are some of the towns in the game. Now of course there were some towns in the original Breath of the Wild, but if you beat Breath of the Wild at the end of the game, they did say they would be focusing on rebuilding Hyrule. And there were a lot of ruins all throughout Hyrule in Breath of the Wild. So what if by the time we're playing the game in Breath of the Wild 2, a lot of those ruins are already being rebuilt, so there could be more towns and areas to explore. That's a whole other way to make the world of Hyrule be different than before. But perhaps there could be some sort of dynamic with this earthquake that could be impacting some of these towns. So that's definitely something that could perhaps even impact your gameplay. But when it comes to the gameplay and exploring this Hyrule, we never actually saw the Sheikah Slate for Link or Zelda. Neither of them were holding it, all throughout the trailer. And not only did we not see the Sheikah Slate, but we did not see the Sheikah Shrines or Towers either. It seems that they all disappear. Perhaps because Calamity Ganon was defeated, perhaps the Sheikah technology detected this defeat and assessed that there was no longer any threats, so all of this technology retreated underground or deactivated. If that's the case, that could mean no Sheikah technology to assist Link or Zelda this time around. Now, we did see Link get possessed, or his hand get possessed by that green sort of glowing hand, and we have seen some concept art for the original Breath of the Wild where a green glowing power could offer him up some abilities. Maybe that could be the replacement for the Sheikah Slate. With no Sheikah Slate, we don't have the runes like Magnesis or Cryonis or Stasis, so perhaps this green glowing hand could give us other abilities. Maybe we could attain a Hookshot ability this time around. That could definitely speed up a lot of exploration, and especially if these tremors and earthquakes really do cause a lot of devastation and change to the land, you might need a Hookshot to really get around in the sequel for Breath of the Wild. And besides, how many mainline Zelda games are we going to go without a Hookshot? The Hookshot is one of the most popular Zelda items, so it'd be really cool to see it return in the sequel. But we won't know until Nintendo decides to reveal a Hookshot for Breath of the Wild 2. So, fingers crossed they bring the item back. But going back to the missing shrines and towers, while it's possible that maybe we just didn't see them because the game was still early in development and they sort of took them out for whatever reason, I'm gonna say because it was a story trailer that seemed fairly developed, they're just not a part of this game. But what's interesting to me is that if the Sheikah Shrines and Towers are no longer there, what could be replacing them? There's gotta be dungeons in Breath of the Wild, And if we're going back to exploring Hyrule, what could we find? What else could we do that could replace the shrines from Breath of the Wild? Well, if you played through Breath of the Wild, you may have noticed there were no typical classical dungeons like previous Zelda games, and a lot of fans have been clamoring for those classic style dungeons. Fans are very happy with the open world style of the game, but a lot of the Divine Beasts weren't really quite comparable to previous dungeons from older Zelda games. So perhaps they will be bringing back bigger, larger dungeons like previous Zelda games. And if you consider the map for Hyrule in Breath of the Wild, there's a lot of nods to pretty much everything from every different Zelda game. But what's interesting is that the only two temples are the Temple of Time and the Forgotten Temple. What about the Forest Temple or the Fire Temple? Or how about the Ancient Cistern from Skyward Sword? There are technically many dungeons that have been explored in Hyrule in previous Zelda games, and they were not referenced at all in Breath of the Wild, which has references to pretty much almost everything from every single Zelda game, save for the dungeons, which is what I'm talking about right now. What if the reasons we didn't see these dungeons in Hyrule was because most of them were either hidden inside mountains, or behind rocks, or underground? And with these tremors and earthquakes, perhaps some of them will be revealed. But like I just said, maybe some others will be underground. The Sheikah shrines and towers go underground, and all throughout this first trailer for Breath of the Wild 2, we see Link and Zelda exploring deep underground Hyrule, below the surface, where there are luminous stones and ruins, and of course, Ganondorf. So what if there's a big focus on exploring below the surface for Hyrule? What if exploring below the surface for Hyrule is actually a big part of the game, and sort of treated like an alternate realm? Kind of like Lorule, or the Dark World, or the Twilight Realm from previous Zelda games. It's something that's been done before, and actually in Metroid Prime, not Zelda, they also have a Dark World, but in Metroid Prime 2, that's where they had the Dark World. A lot of the puzzles related to going back and forth between the Light and Dark World, so maybe in Breath of the Wild 2, they could take up some ideas from there, and there will be some puzzles with some of the dungeons and areas in the game that relate to you going back and forth between above the surface and below the surface. I think there's a really good chance of that, especially considering that there's a lot of shaking with a lot of earthquakes. They could reveal some dungeons in the mountains, but also as we explore below the surface for Hyrule, as there does seem to be a focus on that in the trailer. Like, we do see that one shot that does look like a dungeon. We could be going back and forth doing different puzzles both above and below the surface for dungeons above and below the surface. But beyond these dungeons, where some of them could be reimaginings from previous games, and exploring below the surface and above the surface with the new towns and ruins, and obviously everything changed up from the earthquake, how else will the world be different? Well, did you ever notice just how much verticality there was in Breath of the Wild? You could go really high up. Did you ever take that minecart or those metal boxes and use the magnesis to sort of trick the system so you could fly really high into the air and try to chase the dragons as they went through their portals in the sky? You can get really high up. What if they were to further explore that verticality, that grand space in the sky? We did see one divine beast in the sky, and of course some of the mountains are already really high in Breath of the Wild, but what if they also took this opportunity to bring back other areas in the sky from different Zelda games? We had the Sky Town and some dungeons there with some surrounding islands from Skyward Sword, and of course there was a dungeon from Twilight Princess that was also in the sky. Maybe they could bring those back, and there could be even more to explore in the sky. They could also focus on exploring below the surface of the water in Breath of the Wild too. We were not able to do that in the original Breath of the Wild. We could see the water, we could swim on the top of it, we could throw things under it, and even perhaps sometimes find ways to pull things out and interact with items that do fall in there. But how cool would it be if we actually got to go under the water this time around? I know, going underwater in a video game? That just sounds bonkers. I'm obviously being sarcastic here. That's something they could definitely explore. I don't think that would be that much more of a stretch for them to program, because it's kind of already pretty much programmed in there. They just didn't give us the ability to swim through. In fact, there's actually a glitch where you can look and explore underwater and see a lot of beautiful coral. It's really awesome. I'll try and put a shot of that footage right in this video, but it looks awesome, and that's another element that they could explore for expanding the world of Hyrule. Now, one more thing they could do is simply expand the map for Breath of the Wild 2. Perhaps this time around they'll let us go a little bit further into the water or the desert. or maybe make it across those giant cliffs that lead to an even larger landmass beyond the border for the map of Hyrule. I'm not saying to go on forever, but if they could expand a little bit more, that would be really cool. Did you guys ever see the map for Legend of Zelda 2? So if you take a look at this map that I'll put on screen, that bottom little corner, that little square right there, that is actually a portrayal of the original Hyrule from the original Legend of Zelda. And the current map for Breath of the Wild is basically a reimagining for the original map for Hyrule from the original Legend of Zelda. Meaning that technically, there's actually already a canon world out there that is much larger than just Hyrule. Now, I don't expect for the map size for Breath of the Wild to quadruple here in terms of X and Y coordinates. I've really been focusing on them just going above and below, which is already a lot. But my point is here, there's already a lot of material out there that they could use to explore the outer reaches of the Hyrule map. And on the note of exploring the outer reaches, in particular with the water, it would be really nice if we could see the return of those giant squids from the Wind Waker, another overworld boss. That would be really cool to see. And while we're on the subject, I would love to see even more overworld bosses all throughout the game, along with even more enemy designs, which I sort of expect to see in the sequel. But a couple more things that I would really like to see. I would like to see more dragons, right? I mean, we had the 3 divine dragons, but they weren't enemies, and I want them to still be in the game to some capacity, but it would be cool to see other dragons, perhaps like Volvagia, for example. This is a fantasy medieval world. There should be dragons, some of them should be bad. I think with the sequel, they could really fill out the world for Hyrule and add even more areas, more towns, more enemies. For as dense as Breath of the Wild 1 was, I think the sequel could be even more dense. So with a much denser world, with the landscape changing from the earthquake and rebuilt towns, and obviously you having more abilities to explore the world, and then bringing in more areas into the sky, and also allowing us to go below the surface for Hyrule to explore some of the older dungeons that were never seen, to explore a lot of ancient dungeons that could be reimaginings for previous Zelda games, and also expanding the outer reaches of the Hyrule map just a little bit, bringing in perhaps some areas from The Legend of Zelda 2, the entire world for Hyrule in the sequel to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild could be huge, ginormous, and it would be epic. I mean, whatever the Zelda team decides to do, I think it would be epic, and I wouldn't be surprised if some of the ideas I talked about in this video actually do happen. But what do you guys think? How do you think they will be changing the world of Hyrule for the sequel to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild? Let me know in the comments below. I'm sure you guys have some really good ideas as well. Anyways, everyone, this is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Bye.